Pastor Daniel Harper, sitting on the floor, felt the cold seep through his coat, even with the fire burning. It seemed the heat couldn't penetrate much beyond the flames of the fireplace, as if an invisible wall blocked it. Lydia, Daniel's wife, watched every detail anxiously, noticing that even the oil lamp distributed light in a strange way, as if afraid of shining too brightly. Ethan, his son of only 10 years old, lay stretched out on a woolen blanket that now seemed far too big for him. His face no longer matched the rest of his body. His eyes were enormous, deep-set, too attentive for someone so frail. He breathed rapidly, as if always about to ask for something more, a request that never ends. Even there, protected, the boy's fragility was evident, as if his body were being consumed by something that left no marks. With each movement, the blanket's fabric formed empty folds, revealing his frightening thinness. Pastor Daniel tried to convey calm, but his own hand trembled on his son's shoulder. The other gripped the hymn book so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He tried to think of prayers, but the words escaped him, striking his conscience and slipping away before even reaching his lips. He had always believed that faith was enough, but there in that overly silent cabin, he felt a nagging doubt, like sand in his shoe. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that he was afraid of what he didn't understand. The healer Juniper Hale observed everything unhurriedly, as if waiting for the exact moment to make her first move. She didn't seem frightened, but she also didn't appear calm. She was like someone accustomed to facing situations that most would prefer not to name. Her eyes moved from Ethan to every corner of the cabin, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Her posture, firm and patient, created a strange contrast with the silent despair that hung over Lydia and Daniel, who awaited any sign from her. When Ethan whispered, "I'm hungry," always, the phrase cut through the cabin like a knife. It wasn't an ordinary hunger, not the hunger of a growing child, nor of an overdue meal. It was a hunger that seemed endless, that seemed to spring from a place no one understood. The lamp flickered at that very moment, casting the boy's shadow on the wooden wall. But the shadow stretched out in the wrong way, longer than his body would allow. Lydia held her breath. Daniel lowered his eyes, and Juniper, for the first time that night, murmured, "The moment has come." Juniper began sweeping the floor with dry cedar and mountain sage branches, moving her fist calmly, as if she already knew exactly where each invisible mark should be. The wood creaked under her steps, but the sound seemed trapped in the ground without an echo. Daniel watched every gesture while trying to control the trembling in his hands. He knew this wasn't a church ritual, not something he recognized, but he also couldn't deny that there was a clear purpose there. Lydia just breathed deeply, trying to accept that hope lay in that almost silent movement. With each sweep, Juniper traced a circle that no one could see, but everyone could feel. It was as if the cabin shifted in density, as if a boundary began to emerge there. Not a physical barrier, but something deeper, more ancient, that commanded inexplicable respect. Ethan, lying down, followed everything that happened with his eyes, as if the hunger within him was also paying attention. The air grew thicker as the circle was completed, and Daniel felt a shiver run down his neck, the kind of sensation that doesn't go well with a lit fireplace. When the circle was complete, Juniper placed 4 objects at its corners, each with a weight that was not merely material. At the first point, she left a saucer with coarse salt, scattered like small ice cubes. At the second, a glass of spring water, so clear it seemed to capture the light of the lamp. At the third, she positioned a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, as if guarding a simple secret. At the fourth, a bowl with wood ash mixed with maple bark powder, forming an irregular grey. Each item seemed to draw a piece of the atmosphere to itself. Daniel, restless, tried to break the silence with a loud prayer, seeking strength within himself. But the instant he began to pronounce the first word, Juniper raised her hand. It wasn't a brusque gesture nor a reprimand. It was like holding a musical note in the air so it wouldn't be played out of time. The pastor felt his face flush with shame and frustration, as if he had done something unnecessary. Juniper, however, maintained a neutral gaze, indicating that this was not the right moment to intervene. "Later," she said, her voice low but firm. "First, I listen." No one asked what exactly she was listening to. Everyone was afraid to know. Daniel lowered his gaze, yielding his pride. Lydia intertwined her fingers, accepting that for the first time in weeks, someone seemed to understand the depth of that mystery. Ethan took a deep breath, and the air inside the cabin seemed to follow, as if something invisible had adjusted to the newly formed circle. The preparation was complete, and the atmosphere awaited the next step. Juniper approached Ethan with the calmness of someone who had seen many fragile bodies, but never exactly this kind of fragility. She placed 2 fingers at the base of the boy's neck, not like a doctor checking for a pulse, but like someone trying to feel a hidden vibration. Her eyes narrowed, not in surprise but in recognition. It was like pressing a string that sounds silently, a tension that no one hears, but is there. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her, as if he knew that this touch was not simple. Then Juniper took the glass of spring water and brought it to Ethan's chest height. The water should have risen and fallen gently with the boy's breathing, but that's not what happened. The surface began to tremble erratically, as if another breath, one that didn't come from Ethan, was stirring it. Daniel felt his stomach sink. Lydia put her hand to her mouth, trying not to make a sound. The water formed small, irregular waves, completely disconnected from the boy's fragile body. Ethan swallowed hard, and the sound seemed to echo throughout the entire cabin, as if it carried too much weight. His stomach growled next, loudly, urgently, desperately, and that made Juniper even more alert. It wasn't ordinary hunger. It was a kind of emptiness that didn't match the amount of food he had been trying to eat. Juniper tilted her head, observing the boy with a look that mixed pity and calculation, like someone connecting pieces of an old puzzle. Her breathing subtly shortened. She murmured something so low it sounded like a memory, not directed at her 2 parents. There's an old saying about it, tithing. The word hung in the cabin like heavy dust. Daniel automatically grimaced, as if rejecting the idea before even understanding it. Lydia immediately looked at her husband, knowing he would deny any explanation that wasn't within his religious repertoire. But Juniper wasn't asking for opinions. She was naming something that didn't need approval. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to fill physical space. Daniel opened his mouth to ask a question, but no words came out. Lydia sought support in Juniper's gaze, hoping for more explanations, but the healer remained focused on the boy, as if she were still hearing something the others didn't perceive. The water in the glass finally settled, but the air in the cabin did not. There was a feeling that a conclusion was about to be revealed, and whatever it was, it wouldn't bring immediate comfort. The healer stared at the pastor with a firmness that carried no aggression, but also left no room for escape. It was as if she saw something behind his eyes, something brought from another room, perhaps from another day, perhaps from the church itself. "You brought something into your house, something from the church," the healer said, her voice so calm it hurt more than a shout. Daniel reacted instinctively, shaking his head, ready to deny it, even before fully understanding the accusation. However, the answer came out weak, without conviction. Lydia, behind him, pressed her fingers against her own mouth, trying to hold back tears. It was no surprise to her that there was something left unsaid. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was hiding a detail, however small, believing he was protecting the family. "Daniel," she whispered, letting slip more of a question than a name. Her voice trembled, and this trembling betrayed a fear that had been growing for days, fueled by every lost look, every silence from her husband, every night that Ethan seemed to shrink further into his own body. The pastor swallowed hard, the sound echoing as if the entire cabin were listening. He lowered his head for a moment, wrestling with his own conscience. Denying it would have been reflexive, but denying it in front of the healer seemed futile. It was like lying to someone who already knew the answer. The healer, Juniper, motionless, waited without pressing, without rushing. Her waiting was worse than any explicit accusation. Daniel realized that each second of silence increased the guilt he had been trying to keep to himself. The healer then reached out and asked for 3 items, like someone following a procedure that needs no dramatization. First, something that had touched Ethan's body since he was a baby. A blanket, a diaper, any object that marked the beginning. Then something that represented Daniel's faith. The hymn book he held would serve perfectly. Lastly, she asked for any old metal that has recently arrived at the church. The room stiffened, as if the request had taken the air away for a moment. Lydia turned to her husband with a look that mixed questioning and genuine fear. The pastor's silence became an answer before any words were spoken. Lydia realized it immediately. The healer realized it even sooner. Daniel felt his back grow heavy, as if he were carrying a mistake whose weight was finally becoming visible. He took a deep breath, knowing that hiding the object now would mean putting Ethan at irreversible risk. And even before revealing what it was, everyone in the cabin understood that the truth was about to open. Yet another hole in the Harper family's foundation. A hole where faith and failure mixed without warning. Breathing heavily, Daniel reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag, folded too carefully for something that should have been merely a religious object. He placed the bag on the ground inside the circle, with a hesitation that spoke volumes before its contents appeared. The healer watched without blinking, as if she had already imagined what was to come. Lydia took a step closer, looking at her husband with a heavy heart, for she had never seen him so torn between guilt and fear. The entire cabin seemed to lean towards that small gesture. When Daniel opened the bag, the lamplight slipped across the surface of the silver pattern, revealing a pale, sickly sheen. It wasn't the usual light of clean silver. It was a reflection that seemed to flee from the brightness. The healer Juniper approached slowly, without touching the object, only inclining her face like someone identifying an ancient scent with just a glance. Lydia put her hand to her chest because she sensed something wrong even without understanding why. The silver seemed to absorb the light, not reflect it. It was as if it had a life of its own, a tired yet hungry life. Daniel explained, his voice faltering, that the object had appeared as a donation, left anonymously in the sacristy inside an old box. He believed it was a gift sent by someone who wanted to help the church. He cleaned the paten, carefully stored it and used it in Sunday service, without imagining that something so simple could carry a sinister intention. That same day, Ethan began to complain about a strange sensation. The food went straight past him, as if nothing was left inside him. The connection was direct, clear, but it took Daniel a while to have the courage to see it. The healer didn't accuse, didn't raise her voice, didn't judge. She simply observed the paten with silent respect, like someone gazing at a piece in an ancient and dangerous game. She leaned forward and murmured, "Wrong promise, and the thing that keeps a promise doesn't accept discounts." The phrase landed heavy, but clear. Daniel felt his shoulders slump as if he had carried this mistake alone for weeks, without admitting it. Lydia looked at her husband sadly, not out of anger, but because she realized how much he had tried to protect the church at the expense of his own family. The air inside the cabin shifted as the healer finally took a step back, as if distance were important so that the silver wouldn't pull anything else. The object seemed to pulse with an irregular glow, almost breathing. Ethan's ever-present hunger seemed to intensify at that moment, as if the boy were responding to something he couldn't see. Daniel brought his hand to his face, fighting against the weight of his own guilt. The healer, firm, simply concluded, "Now we know the thread. We just need to cut the path." And for the first time that night, Lydia felt they were entering the most dangerous part of all. The healer placed the pattern in the center of the circle, as if placing a piece that could alter the course of a chessboard. She covered the diseased metal with the breadcloth, pressing the edges lightly, and then blew a thin layer of ash over it, letting each particle fall like dark snow. The gesture was restrained, almost delicate, but carried a firm intention. Lydia watched without blinking, noticing that even the noises of the cabin, the firewood, the lamp, the wind, had subsided, as if awaiting the healer's next move. The entire atmosphere seemed suspended. When she stood up, she asked the pastor to do something he didn't expect to hear there: read a psalm. The healer's voice had no religious imposition, only a practical need, as if his presence needed to be established within the ritual. Daniel hesitated for a moment, remembering the time she had stopped him from praying before. But now it was different. It was as if his role had finally arrived. With still trembling hands, he opened the old hymn book, whose pages already reminded him of so many devotional dawns. His fingers traced the lines until he found a passage that his heart recognized. The pastor began to read, and his voice came out shaky at first, slipping on some words, as if his own faith needed to be reorganized. But gradually his voice gained body, not strength but firmness. The healer kept her singing low, a murmur without a defined melody, almost a breath that moved parallel to the reading. The combination was strange but not conflicting. It was like bringing together two different waters that flow in the same direction. Lydia felt a shiver that wasn't fear. It was the recognition that something was truly moving there. The lamp, which until then had flickered intermittently, began to steady its flame. But Ethan's shadow did not follow the same rhythm. It stretched across the floor, extending until it symbolically touched the covered paten. No one made a sound. The healer merely looked at the shadow as if confirming a suspicion. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing rapidly, and the feeling of hunger seemed to grow a little more, as if the presence of the object awakened something within him. Daniel interrupted his reading for a second, but the healer made a slight gesture for him to continue. As the psalm continued, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once more, becoming heavy and dense, as if the air had thickened. The healer then placed one hand near the cloth covering the paten, without touching it, only feeling it. She murmured something not intended for anyone present, something that sounded more like an old conversation with someone unseen. Ethan pressed his fingers against the blanket, as if something were pulling him from within. And Daniel sped up his reading slightly, trying to maintain his own courage. The healer, resolute, knew this was only the beginning of the real conflict. The healer picked up a small roll of red wool, worn at the edges but firm as something that had served in difficult situations. With precise care, she tied one end around her own wrist, tightening the knot with a calmness that made it clear it wasn't an adornment. It was a tool. Then, she leaned down to tie the other end around Ethan's wrist, who watched everything with large, suspicious and tired eyes. The wool seemed to vibrate slightly between them, as if something was already passing through that improvised path. Lydia held her breath, unsure if it was protection or risk. The healer Juniper explained, without romanticizing it, "This is just a bridge." She didn't say energy, she didn't say spirit, she didn't try to give it pretty or mystical names, just bridge. Daniel felt his stomach clench because, at that moment, he realized that any interference from him could transform this bridge into a dangerous shortcut. The red wool stretched thinly between the healer's wrist and Ethan's, and there was an invisible tension there, as if unseen threads ran parallel to the physical piece of wool. The cabin became quieter, as if paying attention too. With a small pair of short, rounded-tipped scissors, the healer began to make cuts in the air. She didn't cut the red thread, nor did she touch the boy. She cut the space, as if trimming invisible lines caught between Ethan and something no one could see. Each movement made the air vibrate in a strange, almost audible way, like a silk thread being pulled quickly. Ethan gasped suddenly, startled, as if he had received an internal shock. His hands trembled, but there was no pain. It was impact, shock, the breaking of something he couldn't name. Lydia took a step forward, but recoiled when she saw the healer's gaze. Daniel took a step forward, instinctively wanting to protect his son, but the healer interrupted him without words, only with a look that carried absolute authority. "If you trespass, you'll become a path," she said firmly, without raising her voice. That pierced the pastor like a dart. He understood without further explanation. There was something there that would recognize him as a root if he got too close. He retreated slowly, feeling guilt and fear mingle, while trying to keep his eyes on his son but too far away to help. Ethan began to cry, but it was a dry cry, without tears, as if even that had been drained from him over the days. The sound wasn't of ordinary pain. It was of profound exhaustion, of a body being consumed by something that left no external marks. The healer continued cutting the air, each time with greater precision, like someone untying knots that only she could see. The tip of the wool trembled slightly, and Ethan's shadow seemed to contract along with it. The ritual was unhurried, and yet at the same time it seemed too urgent. Something was loosening, inch by inch. The water in the glass began to swirl without anyone touching it, forming a small but deep whirlpool. as if something were pulling the center downwards. Lydia took a step back, clasping her hands to her chest as she watched the movement, completely out of sync with the air in the cabin. The whirlpool didn't seem connected to the wind, nor to Ethan's breathing. It was an independent, almost stubborn movement. The healer watched everything with steady eyes, without surprise, as if confirming a reaction she had expected to happen since the first cut in the air. The entire atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. On the saucer of salt, small spots began to darken, as if tiny drops of soot were appearing out of nowhere and mixing with the grains. It was an irregular darkening, spreading in patches, as if something were trying to grab the salt, chew it, corrupt it. Daniel observed this with a pale face, because he recognized symbolism, but none of it explained what he saw there. Salt had always been a sign of protection for him, something that represented firmness and purity. Seeing it darken made him feel that something was approaching a dangerous limit. The shepherd took a deep breath, trying not to tremble. The piece of bread covered by the cloth sank slightly, as if something invisible had sat on top of it, pressing the air around it. Lydia brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a scream that didn't quite escape. The bread, until then a harmless object, seemed to respond to a presence that no one could see, but which manifested itself without asking permission. The healer leaned forward, assessing every detail, and her hands moved with the experience of someone who had dealt with things that shouldn't exist so close to a child. She knew that this wasn't just a reaction, it was communication. With a steady voice, the healer spoke to the void, not to the parents. "He is not a coin. He is a boy." The phrase hung heavy in the room, and Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine, as if someone behind him were listening intently to those words. Lydia held her breath for a few seconds, expecting some abrupt change. Ethan, even with his eyes half closed, seemed to react with a slight tremor in his chest, as if someone had finally said something he needed to hear. The silence that followed was so intense it felt solid. Then Daniel perceived in a fleeting glimpse the sensation that someone, or something, was counting inside the cabin. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. The rhythm was slow, almost childlike, but completely out of place in the environment. He blinked hard, trying to shake off the feeling, but the echo of that counting seeped into his nerves like ice. The healer turned her head slightly, as if she had also heard it. She didn't comment, she didn't ask. She just took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come, because the invisible thing wasn't just reacting, it was demanding its presence. The healer removed the cloth covering the paten, revealing the sickly sheen of the silver under the flickering lamplight. Without haste, she picked up the small bottle of dark maple syrup and let a slow stream fall onto the metal. The sweet scent spread immediately, cutting through the heavy air like a warm line through the cold. Lydia noticed the atmosphere shift as soon as the syrup touched the surface. It was as if the room held its breath, waiting for a response. Ethan opened his eyes for a moment, as if the aroma reached him from within. The healer placed the paten on the saucer of coarse salt, creating a contact that seemed too symbolic to be merely a ritual gesture. The sweet on the metal met the salt below, and the combination produced a slight tension in the air, almost imperceptible but present nonetheless. Daniel felt his chest tighten. It didn't seem like religion, it didn't seem like science, it didn't seem like anything he knew, but it worked as if it had been created precisely for this kind of threat. Lydia squeezed her own hands, observing every detail, trying to understand what was happening to her son. "If you want food, take what comes from the earth," the healer declared firmly, without raising her voice. "Not what comes from the flesh." The phrase echoed through the hut like a boundary no one could cross. The swirling water in the glass slowed, the darkening of the salt seemed to pause, and the invisible weight on the bread lessened by a few millimeters. It was as if something were evaluating the offer, considering whether or not to accept the exchange. Daniel swallowed hard, aware that a silent negotiation was underway and that he could not interfere. Ethan let out an unexpected sob, a small sound but one laden with something different from the constant hunger that had been gnawing at his days. He placed his hand on his chest, as if feeling something melting inside. When he opened his mouth, he didn't say hunger for the first time in weeks. Instead, he murmured in a whisper, "It's hot." The boy frowned, as if puzzled by his own sensation, trying to decipher this new warmth that spread slowly but steadily through his thin body, which until then seemed only to be emptying. Lydia fell to her knees beside him, overcome by a relief she still dared not believe. Daniel let out a sigh that had been held back for days, but he didn't approach. He remembered the healer's warning that interfering could become a hindrance. The healer observed everything with restrained attention, like someone who knows the battle isn't over, but recognizes when an important step has been taken. The air in the cabin softened slightly, as if the invisible thing had retreated an inch. The negotiation was far from over, but for the first time the boy seemed to have space to inhabit his own body. The healer approached Ethan with the same unwavering calm she had maintained from the beginning, but there was something different now. A silent intensity, as if her steps marked the exact rhythm between risk and salvation. She looked at Daniel, not with judgment, but with an urgency that came from ancient knowledge. "Now, Daniel," the healer said, "say your son's name as you did the day you thought you were going to lose him." The phrase struck the pastor like a flash, pulling up memories he had kept locked away since the boy's difficult birth. Daniel opened his mouth, but his voice didn't come immediately. It seemed trapped behind years of prayers, responsibilities, and guilt he himself had piled up. Lydia turned to him, silently imploring him not to hesitate. The healer waited, observing the pastor's every micro-gesture, like someone assessing the last brick before an arch collapses or stands firm. The red thread attached to Ethan's wrist trembled slightly, almost as if awaiting the right command to release a flow that couldn't yet run. The entire cabin seemed to lean towards that moment. When the voice finally came out, it was broken but true. "Ethan," Daniel said, not as an everyday call, but as a plea for life. The name echoed in the heavy air, filling the cabin as if occupying every corner at once. At the exact moment of the word, Ethan took a deep breath, an air that seemed too big for his fragile chest. His body expanded slightly, as if finding inner space that had been lost for weeks. Lydia brought her hands to her mouth, unable to hold back the tears. The boy's breathing changed, not strong but full. The water in the glass stopped swirling. The coarse salt on the saucer cleared, leaving behind only a few dark spots that evaporated like light dust. The bread returned to its original shape, undoing the sinking caused by the invisible presence. The lamp stabilized, offering a continuous light that no longer flickered, as if someone had turned off an internal wind. Daniel felt his chest loosen for the first time since the beginning of that night, not daring to fully believe what he saw. The healer observed everything with attentive eyes, without celebrating because the process was still to be completed. The healer quickly gathered the red thread, twisting it precisely around her own hand. She dipped the end into the bowl of ashes, sealing it with a dark layer. Then she pressed a small cap of hot wax over the final knot, creating a tiny seal that seemed insignificant but carried evident symbolic weight. With that, she simply said, "That's it for today." There was no spectacle, no dramatization, just closure. Lydia fell beside her son, touching his now warm face. Daniel exhaled a sigh that seemed to carry weeks of tension, and the healer, Sirius, knew the danger had receded, but it hadn't disappeared. As dawn began to break through the cracks in the cabin, the soft light of sunrise found Ethan lying on his side, breathing more fully, as if each breath now had space to exist. Lydia, who had barely slept, noticed the boy's movement first and approached slowly, afraid of breaking that fragile moment. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, and for the first time in weeks they had a gleam, not the feverish gleam of endless hunger, but something gentle, alive, present. Lydia brought her hand to her face, surprised by the relief that threatened to spill into tears. "Water?" Ethan murmured in a simple, common, almost everyday tone. The request sounded like music to Lydia's ears, who rushed to the glass and brought it to her son's lips. Daniel watched the scene with a feeling that mixed gratitude, disbelief, and guilt. He didn't dare get too close. He still feared interfering in something delicate. But when Ethan drank, slowly and without urgency, the pastor felt the world rearrange itself within him. It wasn't a spectacular miracle. It was a common gesture that had become impossible until yesterday. Then, with disarming naturalness, Ethan said, "Mom, I want pancakes." The phrase hit Daniel and Lydia like a warm wave. It wasn't just a request for food. It was living proof that the emptiness consuming the boy had ceased. Lydia laughed and cried at the same time, a choked, incredulous laugh that seemed to come from a place inside her that had been extinguished for a long time. Daniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder, feeling that there was still too much bone under the skin, but also realizing something new, the sensation that the boy's body was there, present, inhabited. The healer, observing from a corner of the hut, did not celebrate. She knew that early signs could deceive those in a hurry. Her gaze swept over Ethan from head to toe, assessing every detail with precision. She saw that his thinness was still extreme, that his bones still showed painfully, but she recognized the essential difference. The feeling of emptiness had stopped. Something inside the boy had withdrawn, or been pushed away, or perhaps simply fallen asleep. But the threat that consumed his body was no longer actively present. The healer breathed deeply, in recognition, not in relief. Before allowing the family to leave the cabin, the healer listed instructions with the firmness of someone who understands the weight of these transitions. Simple food, warmth, sleep, and the paten never returns to the church. Each sentence was short, definitive, laden with an authority that no one questioned anymore. Daniel nodded, understanding that this was not a suggestion. It was a rule of survival. Lydia wrapped Ethan in her coat, holding him carefully, and as they crossed the threshold of the cabin, they all felt it. The night had ended, but the story had not. Weeks before the worst happened, Dorset seemed to be experiencing one of those peaceful Sundays that almost seem invented. The scent of pine rose from the hills, mingling with the sweet aroma of the cake served after church, a tradition that always brought residents together in the small square. Ethan ran between the church pews with other children, laughing loudly, stumbling over his own enthusiasm. The sun streamed through the simple stained glass windows, coloring the wooden floor with warm patches. Nothing about that day suggested that the Harper family's life was about to change so abruptly and darkly. Daniel watched his son with a slight, almost unassuming pride. After difficult months at church, he felt that finally everything seemed to be falling into place. The congregation was slowly growing again. The faithful seemed more present, and even the internal arguments had diminished. Singing the hymns that Sunday had been simple, fluid, as if the community breathed in unison. Lydia set the tables for the communal lunch, chatting with neighbors, enjoying the normalcy she rarely questioned. It was one of those days you live without realizing its importance, until it disappears. The small, unassuming church in Dorset bore the marks of decades of community history. It had worn pews at the edges, hymn books with loose pages, and a sacristy organized as best it could be. Daniel always said that building was his second home, but that Sunday it was more than that. It was his haven, his relief, his sign that the hard times were behind him. He walked through the nave collecting papers, putting away objects and exchanging friendly greetings. Nothing seemed out of place. Not a single detail caught his attention. It was only after the service, when almost everyone had already left, that Daniel noticed a box discreetly left on the sacristy table. A simple cardboard box with dust marks and a loose ribbon. There was no note attached to the outside, nor any sign of who had left it. Daniel imagined it was some ordinary donation. The church always received various objects, from altar cloths to old books. There was no reason to be suspicious. He opened the box slowly, believing he would find something useful, perhaps even symbolic, for the next service. The way Daniel held that box would later be remembered as an overly innocent gesture. At that moment, however, it seemed merely part of the routine. He called Lydia from afar to help him put away some items, while the box remained there open, silent, waiting to be fully noticed. The sun still illuminated the sacristy, casting a clean light on every surface. It was a clear, simple, carefree Sunday, exactly the kind of day that precedes something no one is prepared to face. Inside the box left in the sacristy, Daniel found the silver paten carefully wrapped in an old cloth. The fabric had a subtle smell of a closed cupboard, but not of abandonment, more like an object kept for a long time, waiting for someone to use it again. Unwrapping the cloth, the silver revealed a strange sheen, not exactly beautiful, but striking in a way difficult to explain. It seemed like light escaping out of necessity, not reflection. Daniel ran his thumb along the edge of the object, feeling the metal too cold for a sunny day. At the bottom of the box was a simple note, written in shaky handwriting, saying only, "For whatever is needed." The message was vague, but Daniel immediately interpreted it as providence. It was something he always told the faithful. God sends what is needed at the right time. And on that Sunday of rare tranquility, it was easy to believe it. He raised the paten to eye level, examining stains that seemed part of his own history. Small irregularities that wouldn't come off even when he rubbed carefully. Still, he saw no reason for distrust. For a pastor accustomed to dealing with scarcity, receiving a silver utensil seemed almost a sign of renewal. Daniel placed the folded cloth on the table and arranged the paten on top of it, as if presenting it to the space. He felt a modest, sincere satisfaction, imagining that it would bring a beautiful symbolism to the communion service. Lydia entered the sacristy at that moment, and he showed her the object with a slight smile, briefly explaining the mysterious donation. Lydia approved, but let slip a curious glance at the uneven shine of the metal. At the next service, Daniel decided to use the paten without a second thought. It was the kind of gesture he believed reinforced the reverence of the ceremony, something that showed care for sacred details. He cleaned the object once more before going up to the pulpit, trying to remove stubborn stains, but without success. Still, the silver seemed to fulfill its role with dignity. When he raised the object before the congregation, a small reflection crossed the nave, drawing the attention of some people, including Ethan, who observed everything in unusual silence. Daniel didn't realize at that moment that the boy was too quiet, too still, too focused on the paten, as if it had a weight pulling his gaze. For the pastor, the service went well, simple and harmonious. He carefully stored the paten in the sacristy after the ceremony and ended Sunday with a feeling of mission accomplished. It was impossible to imagine that, in that seemingly banal moment, something had been activated, something that had nothing to do with providence, and that, in the following weeks, would exact an unthinkable price within the Harper household. That night, after the service where the paten was used for the first time, Ethan ate dinner twice. Lydia found it curious but not alarming. Children have phases of increased appetite. The boy seemed cheerful, asked for another slice of bread, and commented that his stomach still felt kind of empty. Daniel laughed, finding it amusing, and joked about growth spurts arriving suddenly. Nothing that night suggested anything sinister. Ethan seemed just a hungry child, the kind of detail any parent would dismiss lightly, without imagining it was the beginning of something much bigger. In the following days, however, his appetite ceased to be a common excess and began to become the norm. Ethan would wake up asking for food even before fully opening his eyes. He ate quickly, as if the plate would disappear from the table, and yet 10 minutes later he would say he needed more. Lydia tried to organize extra meals, but soon realized that no sequence would work. The boy would eat and remain empty, as if the food didn't stay long enough to nourish him. What had previously seemed like a phase began to sound like something that defied any simple explanation. The most frightening change came in silence. Ethan didn't complain of pain, didn't cough, didn't have a fever or unusual fatigue, nothing that indicated illness. He just ate and shrank. His clothes began to get loose within days. His favorite pants slipped off his waist. His coat looked like it belonged to another child. Lydia watched these changes with growing anxiety, trying to gauge the differences without alarmism, but realizing that something was wrong. It wasn't just the weight that was disappearing. It was as if the boy was losing density. Daniel tried to rationalize. He said it might be a growth spurt, maybe a fast metabolism, maybe anxiety. He himself tried not to show excessive worry so as not to affect his son. But every time he held Ethan in his arms, especially to put him to bed, he felt the boy was getting too light in a way that didn't match the absurd amount of food he was consuming. It was like holding something that was being drained from the inside. No one said it aloud, but Daniel's hands trembled after each attempt to reassure his wife. The silence inside the house began to take on a different weight. Ethan never complained, never said he was sick. He only repeated without drama, without exaggeration, "I'm still hungry." Lydia began to avoid looking directly at his face when he said this, because increasingly the request sounded like an echo, not like a child's voice. Daniel, in turn, began to feel that he had ignored an important detail, something he might have brought into the house without realizing it. But at that moment, still far from real despair, he had no idea that that first symptom was only the tip of something that didn't obey the rules of ordinary life. When the symptoms began to defy any domestic logic, Lydia took Ethan to the pediatrician, believing they would finally find a concrete answer. The office smelled of disinfectant and fresh toilet paper, and the normalcy of the environment made Lydia wish it would all end there, with a simple diagnosis. The doctor examined Ethan carefully, asked basic questions, had him lift his shirt, touched his prominent ribs, listened to his lungs, and measured his blood pressure. His expression changed subtly, but not enough to betray concern. He ordered blood and metabolism tests, confident that something would show up in the numbers. Days later, the results came in, all as expected. Normal levels, nothing altered, nothing that explained why the boy seemed to be disappearing from the inside. The doctor gave generic suggestions: hormonal changes, an adjustment phase, possible childhood anxiety. Lydia listened to everything with growing frustration, struggling not to cry in front of him. How could it be anxiety if she was the only one who seemed anxious? How could it be a phase if Ethan ate like someone who couldn't get enough? She left the office carrying a bag of vitamins that she didn't believe would make a difference. Daniel, upon receiving the news of the normal test results, stood still for a few moments, unsure how to react. He had always believed that science and faith could go hand in hand, but seeing science fail so quickly ignited something uncomfortable within him. He intensified his prayers, opened the church at improbable hours, lit candles, recited psalms he never recited aloud. He asked for answers, for clarity, for a reason. Each prayer seemed to knock on a closed door, returning to him with the weight of his own voice. Still he persisted, because giving up would mean admitting he was losing his son to something he didn't understand. Meanwhile, Dorset began to murmur. People offered hypotheses, some compassionate, others laden with judgment. "It's a test of faith," some said. "There's something wrong in that church," others whispered. Daniel tried to ignore it, but each rumor seemed to seep through the bricks of the house, increasing the weight on his shoulders. Lydia, tired of spiritual abstractions and empty comments, spent nights sitting beside Ethan's bed, watching him sleep. And it was in this heavy silence that she perceived something frightening. Even asleep, the boy seemed distant, as if his body were there, but some part of it was always missing. The overall feeling in the house made everything more oppressive. Mealtimes were tense moments, because Ethan ate urgently and seconds later seemed frustrated, like someone trying to hold water in their hands. Daniel tried to smile, but the smile came out crooked. Lydia, who was normally practical, began to save extra plates as if the boy would ask for more at any moment, and yet nothing changed. The hunger continued, the extreme lightness continued. The absence of explanation became its own torment, and without realizing it, the remaining hope began to lean towards another kind of search, one they didn't yet know how to name. Lydia always enjoyed capturing simple family moments, and it was on an ordinary afternoon during the town fair that she took a picture of Ethan eating a maple candy. At the time, everything seemed normal: the shy smile, the loose coat, the soft light of the late afternoon. Only days later, while reviewing the images on her phone, did she notice something that made her stomach sink. Ethan's face was clear, but his body seemed washed out, as if the image had lost density around him. It was as if the boy's physical presence hadn't been fully captured by the camera. Lydia showed the photo to Daniel that night while Ethan slept. The pastor tried to give a quick explanation: focus problem, movement, bad lighting. But looking again, he realized that nothing matched a technical glitch. In the other photos from the same moment, everything was normal: people, objects, the background. Only Ethan seemed incomplete. Daniel insisted that cameras sometimes do these things, trying to maintain a calm tone, but his own gaze couldn't sustain that attempt. It was clear that that image had affected him more than he wanted to admit. The anxiety intensified when, days later, Lydia woke up in the middle of the night and found Ethan in the kitchen. He was eating a piece of bread, chewing quickly as always, but what was terrifying was the detail she saw before she even blinked. For a single second, an instant that could have been dismissed if it hadn't been so clear, the boy's shadow didn't follow the movement of his body. While Ethan bit into the bread, his shadow remained motionless on the wall, frozen in a position he wasn't making. Lydia held her breath, feeling a dry chill run down her back. When she blinked again, the shadow returned to normal, following the boy as if nothing had happened. Ethan didn't even realize he was being watched. He just chewed and said with the same unsettling calm, "I'm still hungry." Lydia leaned against the sink to avoid falling. The kitchen was too quiet, and the sound of the boy chewing seemed to echo more than it should. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She just stared, as if trying to understand if she had really seen what she thought she had seen, or if exhaustion was playing cruel tricks on her. The following morning, Lydia told Daniel everything, but the pastor tried to rationalize again. He said she was exhausted, that the kitchen lights might have created a strange illusion, that shadows sometimes cast oddly. But as he spoke, his gaze betrayed something. He too had noticed strange things, too small to admit, but enough to unsettle him. The pastor's denial wasn't disbelief, it was fear. And at that point, though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew that something inside the house was exceeding the limits of what they called normal. When Lydia decided to seek help from someone outside the medical and religious circles, it wasn't on impulse, it was out of exhaustion. She needed to talk to someone who wouldn't respond with pre-prepared formulas. That's when she sought out Mrs. Colleen Rusk, an elderly neighbor known for keeping stories that seemed to survive the test of time. The woman, always seated in a rocking chair on the porch, listened to Lydia in silence, without interrupting, without expressing surprise. The light wind rustled the dry leaves around her, creating a rhythm that matched the growing strangeness of the confession. When Lydia finished, Mrs. Rusk rested her hands on the arms of her chair, as if carrying knowledge too difficult to impart quickly. "This reminds me of what they used to talk about in the maple camps," she began, her voice hoarse. "They talked about an old thing, something that takes a tenth." Lydia frowned, uncomprehending. The old woman continued, "They said that when someone made a wrong promise or offered a sacred symbol unknowingly, this thing would take payment as it saw fit." The word payment pierced Lydia like ice, though she still tried to rationalize it. Mrs. Rusk explained that in the region's oldest tradition, the tithe didn't signify money. It signified life, energy, substance, something vital. Anything offered in the wrong way became an open door to a kind of hunger that didn't choose its target, only followed the trail of the dedicated object. Lydia felt her mouth go dry as she thought of the paten the morning Daniel brought it home, and how Ethan began to wither away soon after. It was as if the pieces were silently, yet brutally, beginning to align. The old woman watched each of her reactions, knowing that understanding hurt. When Lydia asked what could be done, she expected to hear something about church, doctors, isolation, anything that seemed commonplace. But Mrs. Rusk only glanced at the woods in the distance and said with a sigh, "If anyone can help, it's her." Lydia took a second to understand whom the woman was referring to. The name came softly, almost like superstition. The healer. The sound of the word seemed to carry a weight that didn't belong with gossip. It was respect mixed with fear. It was the kind of name one didn't say lightly, nor visit without real reason. Lydia tried to confirm, asking if there wasn't another option, an outside doctor, a specialist. But Mrs. Rusk only shook her head firmly, as if she had seen stories repeat secrets from generation to generation. There are things a doctor can't see, and there are things a pastor can't face alone. Lydia felt her heart clench, because that meant they were entering territory beyond anything they knew. Even so, it was the first explanation that made sense, and the first clear step toward the only person who could truly see what no one else could, the healer. Before becoming the figure many avoided naming, the healer had been simply Juniper Hale, the midwife called upon on stormy nights when the ambulance didn't arrive, and winter swallowed the narrow roads of Dorset. She was the one who crossed the woods with firm steps, carrying a leather bag full of herbs, cloths, and knowledge that no one taught in any class. To half the village, she was the woman who appeared when the doctor couldn't. To the other half, she was someone who knew more than she should about things that didn't belong in the light of day. Even so, everyone trusted her when life hung by a thread. Over time, however, the healer began to assume a role that went beyond that of ordinary midwives. There was a silent wisdom in the way she observed doors, windows, crooked crosses on the walls, or pieces of wood that creaked at the wrong time. She said that certain houses needed salt on the threshold, that certain objects should not enter certain homes, and that promises made in haste were the most dangerous, because they opened doors that no one intended to keep open. These words, always spoken calmly, began to circulate through the village as stories that no one knew whether they were advice or warnings. With the arrival of new generations and the modernization of the city, many began to look at the healer with a mixture of respect and distrust. She never defended herself, never argued, never tried to convince anyone of what she knew. She simply continued her work, bringing children into the world, caring for the sick, closing windows that let the wind pass through incorrectly. The woods behind her house seemed to age differently, as if they carried their own calendar. There, winter arrived earlier and left last, and few dared to cross that path without a strong reason. Despite the distance the community maintained, the healer never asked permission to exist within their own territory. She moved between the boundaries of what was natural and what was inexplicable without changing her tone of voice. To those who were afraid, she was the stranger at the edge of the woods. To those who needed her, she was the only person capable of doing something when everything else had failed. Her authority did not come from superstition or threats, but from the number of impossible situations she had silently faced, far from the eyes that judged without understanding. And so when Lydia finally heard the healer's name in response, something inside her recognized that this was the path they were inevitably being pushed down. Because in Dorset, no one sought out the healer without a real reason, and no one would leave the same after passing through her door. The village knew this even when it pretended not to. And at that moment, without realizing it, the Harper family was about to cross the border that separates the everyday from the inexplicable, the same border the healer had guarded for decades. When Lydia first mentioned the possibility of seeking out the healer, Daniel felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. The idea hit him like a blow to the chest, not out of disbelief, but out of conflict. As a spiritual leader, resorting to the healer seemed like admitting weakness in his own faith, as if he were renouncing what he preached every Sunday. The pastor paced the room silently, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to organize thoughts that grew heavier with each passing minute. It wasn't just pride, it was fear of betraying the role to which he had dedicated his life. During the following week, Daniel tried to persist in the path of traditional faith. He held vigils at church, put Ethan to sleep with whispered prayers, and fasted silently, hoping some answer would appear. However, while he sought solace in the Psalms, Ethan continued to lose weight, and his hunger seemed to deepen, becoming almost mechanical, independent of food. Lydia watched her husband with a mixture of love and growing impatience. His attempts, though sincere, sounded like insisting on a door that was already clearly locked. One night, seeing Daniel kneeling on the living room floor praying with a broken voice, Lydia finally lost her composure. She approached and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "If God uses doctors, he can use people from the forest too," she said, with an assertiveness he hadn't expected. Daniel slowly looked up, and the simple phrase sank too deeply to ignore. It wasn't blasphemy, it wasn't a challenge, it was the truth, and that was what hurt the most. Realizing that perhaps she was letting her son suffer because she was afraid to admit that she needed help that didn't come from the usual channels. Daniel tried to argue, but his own voice failed him. He knew Lydia was right, but accepting that meant acknowledging that part of the problem might have started with himself by bringing home an object he didn't understand. He felt torn between two loyalties, the faith he carried in his heart and the urgency to save his son, who seemed to disappear day by day. The resistance didn't stem from distrust of the healer, but from an old pride, cultivated over the years, which now proved useless in the face of Ethan's suffering. That morning, the pastor realized he had been postponing the inevitable. He looked at his son asleep on the sofa, his body too light under the blanket, and felt such deep guilt that he could barely breathe. Ethan's weak breathing was a cruel reminder that time was running out. And at that moment, Daniel finally understood. It no longer mattered how he would be seen by the congregation, nor what that would mean for his role. What mattered was only what he could give his son a real chance. And that chance now had a clear path: the healer. At the Christmas choir rehearsal, the church was full of young voices trying to hit notes that always slipped a little. Ethan, even though weak, insisted on participating. Daniel thought it might be good for the boy to feel part of something normal, but seeing him climb onto the small step with the group, his heart tightened. His coat seemed even larger on him, and the way he held the hymn book showed the effort to keep his arms steady. Still, the pastor tried to reassure himself. At least there was music, people, light, things that should dispel any shadows. The children began to sing, and Ethan joined in with a frail but present whisper. Lydia, at the back of the ship, watched her son with growing concern. She noticed he was trying to keep the rhythm, but his body seemed to fight against its own weight, or lack thereof. Still, nothing prepared anyone for what happened next. Mid-song, Ethan's face simply went blank. There was no warning, no visible dizziness. It was as if someone had flipped an internal switch. The hymn book slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dry thud. Daniel was the first to reach him, rushing down the aisle in quick steps that almost broke his pastoral composure. He lifted his son in his arms and for the first time brutally realized how light the boy was. Light in a way that wasn't human. Lydia arrived soon after, touching Ethan's face while repeating his name, pleading for any reaction. The other children fell into absolute silence, and the choir, which had previously filled the church with harmony, now seemed like a distant echo in the face of the boy's sudden fall. The fainting spell lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to reveal the limit the family had been ignoring out of fear. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from a place too deep. He murmured something incomprehensible, touched his stomach and closed his eyes again, as if the effort of existing was becoming too heavy. Daniel felt the entire church floor move beneath his feet, not physically, but symbolically. The faith he held was being pushed to a breaking point. Lydia looked at her husband and said nothing, because they both knew. This was the trigger. A few hours later, with night falling and the fog creeping between the houses of Dorset, Daniel made the decision he had been avoiding. He grabbed his coat, wrapped Ethan in blankets, and called Lydia to the car. There was no prayer before leaving, no speech, no theological reflection. There was only urgency. The engine seemed to protest against the cold as they sped along the narrow road leading to the woods, and within that heavy silence, Daniel finally accepted that he couldn't face this alone. They needed the only person who saw beyond what ordinary eyes could perceive: the healer. The healer's cabin emerged as a dark stain in the low fog, almost absorbing the light from the headlights. The surrounding woods seemed to hold the cold in their own way, more intensely, as if that part of the forest had its own climate. Daniel parked the car with trembling hands and got out, carefully holding Ethan, feeling the weight of his son, who was too light. Lydia walked beside them, looking in every corner, as if something invisible could move among the trees. With each step, Ethan seemed more restless, as if his body were rejecting the approach of that place. Before Daniel could knock, the door opened. The healer was there, firm, looking directly at him as if seeing someone arriving late to put out a fire that had been burning for days. There was no surprise, no formality. She simply inclined her head in a short gesture, acknowledging the urgency in the air. Ethan, in his father's arms, let out a low, almost silent moan, and Lydia felt the boy's body tremble, as if the entrance to that cabin activated something that had been hiding within him. The healer noticed, without needing to ask anything. Upon entering, Daniel immediately sensed that the cabin's atmosphere was different. The air seemed heavier, but also more organized, as if everything there obeyed a kind of silent order. The healer gestured for them to place Ethan on a woolen blanket spread on the floor. She didn't ask what they had tried, didn't demand lengthy explanations. She simply said with firm calm, "Here, the price is sincerity." The phrase carried no threat. It was the rule. Lydia nodded immediately. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling that this line was harder to cross than any other. The healer raised her palm, asking for absolute silence. "And no authority in here," she added, looking directly at Daniel. "If you try to control what you don't understand, you'll just make things worse." The pastor felt his face flush with a mixture of shame and recognition. It cut deep, because it was true. He took a deep breath and nodded discreetly. Lydia placed her hand on his shoulder for support, and also as a reminder that they needed to relinquish control to save their son. As the healer watched Ethan, the boy reacted in an unexpected way. His hunger seemed to intensify. He clutched the blanket between his fingers, breathing rapidly, as if something inside him was reacting to the proximity of that space. Lydia knelt beside him, but the healer held her by the forearm, asking her to wait. "There are things that don't like being brought here," she said, in a tone that mixed warning and observation. Daniel felt his heart pound in his chest, and finally understood that they weren't just there to ask for help. They were there to confront what they had unknowingly allowed into their lives. Before the critical point of that night, before Ethan's shadow lengthened, and before the air in the cabin held its breath, the healer began a silent, almost secret procedure. Ethan lay on the blanket, his eyes sunken, his breath shallow, while Daniel and Lydia watched without daring to interrupt. The healer placed the Peyton on the floor and dripped a few drops of pure water onto the metal. What should have seeped slowly simply vanished, as if the dish absorbed the drops before they even fully touched the surface. It wasn't evaporation, it was vanishing. An instantaneous emptying that made Lydia hold her breath. The healer tilted her face, bringing her ear close as if trying to hear something coming from the floor itself. Daniel didn't understand the gesture at first, but soon realized she was gauging some kind of response. Then came the sound, a muffled rhythm, almost imperceptible, tapping on the floor like invisible fingers touching wood. 1, 2, 3. The sound was slow, spaced out, yet present. Lydia squeezed her husband's arm and felt his body stiffen. The healer closed her eyes, listening precisely to each tap, like someone recognizing an ancient, unsettling yet familiar pattern. The count continued to 10, each number marked by a touch that didn't come from any human being in the room. Daniel swallowed hard, but didn't dare utter a word. He felt something inside him sink, as if that count was weighing on his conscience and not just on the floor. It was as if something was checking, verifying, demanding an explanation. Lydia placed her hand on her chest, trying to control the panic that arose with that impossible cadence. Ethan, even weak, seemed to react. His fingers twitched, pulling at the blanket as if some part of him recognized that count. The healer then stood up slowly and looked at Daniel firmly. It wasn't an accusation, but a confirmation. "It's the tithe," she said, her voice low but incisive. "And it comes from what you brought into the church." The sentence struck the pastor like a blow, because there was no pause to soften the truth. He felt his chest tighten in a way that no psalm had been able to soothe. The healer didn't expect justifications. She didn't need him to tell the story of the pattern, she already knew. The reaction of the object and the count on the floor were clear enough answers. Without waiting for an invitation, the healer ordered Daniel to permanently remove the Peyton from the church and accept his responsibility without trying to cover up the mistake with religious explanations. The pastor, for the first time in a long time, did not argue. He simply nodded, with an expression that mixed shame and bitter relief. Lydia held his hand, understanding the weight of it. The healer then carefully collected the Peyton, as if handling something that was still alive and hungry. From that moment on, the ritual of containment was no longer an option, it was an urgent necessity. And everyone knew, the cost was far from being paid. After the abrupt reversal, when Ethan finally breathed as if he belonged to his own body, the healer didn't allow Daniel and Lydia to relax. She knew that this wasn't closure, but rather an interval. As soon as the boy fell asleep with a healthier tiredness, the healer called the shepherd to accompany her to the edge of the woods. The morning mist was thicker than usual, and the cold seemed to rise from the ground as if from an ancient memory of the forest. Lydia stayed with Ethan, while Daniel followed the healer, feeling his footsteps sink into the damp earth. They arrived at a moss-covered stone marker, a piece of rock so old it seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The healer knelt there, opening the bag where she had kept the paten wrapped in thick cloth and salt. Daniel watched silently, noticing how the silver seemed less bright since the ritual, as if it had been emptied of the hunger that made it dangerous. Beside the paten was the small wax seal that held the red thread, now hardened, with the mark of the ashes still visible. The healer placed both on the stone, preparing the spot with almost liturgical precision. She dug with her hands, without using a shovel, as if each movement required direct contact with the earth. The grave wasn't deep, but it was enough to isolate what they would bury there. Daniel knelt beside her, hesitant, unsure whether he should help or just watch. The healer glanced at him quickly, and the gesture was enough to indicate that this work needed to be done together. He extended his trembling hands and helped push the earth aside, feeling the damp cold seep under his fingernails. The silence of the woods seemed to observe, attentive, without interfering. When the hole was ready, the healer placed the paten and the wax seal inside, carefully arranging them as if their position mattered. Then she poured a handful of salt over everything, forming a white layer that seemed to erase the presence of those objects. "You don't destroy old hunger," she said, her voice low but firm. "You imprison it. You deceive it. You give it another path." Daniel listened to each word with a mixture of astonishment and shame. He asked in a whisper if this was a sin. The healer turned to him and replied with stark simplicity, "Sin is letting a boy become a receipt." They covered the hole together, pressing the earth down with their hands until the ground seemed intact again. The healer placed a dry branch over the exact spot, marking it subtly, almost invisibly. Then she stood up slowly, wiping the earth from her hands, while observing the edge of the woods with a watchful gaze, as if checking if something had truly been contained. Daniel stood still for a few seconds, trying to breathe normally again. The healer simply said, "Now go back to him." And as they walked back to the cabin, the shepherd realized that, although the immediate danger had been eliminated, that story still held echoes that wouldn't be buried so easily. In the days following the sealing, the Harper household finally began to breathe again. Ethan slowly regained color, eating without urgency, sleeping without groans, asking for simple things like soup, warm milk, and bedtime stories. Hunger still lingered in some deep corner of the boy's memory, but it no longer controlled his body. Daniel watched each small progress with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment, always remembering the guilt that almost cost his son his life. Lydia, for her part, remained focused on the present, cleaning the house, organizing meals, and keeping the fireplace lit, as if warmth were now part of the cure. When Ethan dreamed, however, he still whispered strange things. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he would call for his mother, saying that someone was counting to 10 outside the door. Lydia would rock him until he fell asleep again, swearing to herself that it was just a remnant of the trauma, not a presence. Daniel, listening from afar, tried to recite psalms discreetly, without his son noticing. Gradually he returned to the pulpit, but in a different way, less rigid, more human. One Sunday, he decided to tell the congregation what had happened, not out of superstition, but out of responsibility. The church reacted in a divided way, some shocked, others relieved, some outraged. The pastor's sincerity, however, struck everyone present. Daniel spoke about the danger of touching the sacred without understanding the depth that certain things carry. He spoke of pride, of fear, and of mistakes that can open doors that no one wants to cross. Lydia observed the reactions, noticing who recoiled, who cried, who finally seemed to understand the weight of what they were hearing. For some, the story was too absurd. For others, it made sense in an uncomfortable way. But for Lydia, the important thing was that Daniel was finally acknowledging what he needed to acknowledge. Ethan, sitting beside her, seemed to absorb the peace of that moment. Meanwhile, in the cabin at the edge of the woods, the healer returned to her silent routine. The ritual was complete, but she knew that nothing connected to the ancient hunger ever truly disappears. She organized her jars, repositioned herbs in pots, aligned bowls, checking each object as if surveying invisible boundaries. The lamp illuminated only what was necessary. Outside, the woods remained quiet, heavy, but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that accompanies situations that have been contained but not forgotten. The healer moved attentively, as if a small detail could reveal if something had escaped its place. Late at night, when the healer finished her chores, a sound cut through the silence. A bell ringing once, coming from somewhere distant in the woods. There was no wind, there was no movement. The healer slowly raised her face, without fear, just attentive. She looked at the shelf where she kept the salt pot and the small wax vial containing the sealed red thread. The pot was slightly displaced, not enough to look like it had fallen, but enough to not be a coincidence. The healer extinguished the lamp with a slow breath and murmured to the darkness, "I can count too."